Hello, everyone. This is the fifth episode of season two of the Youth for Discourse podcast, and we are starting right now with the topic identity politics harmful for political advocacy. Now, hello, everyone. You guys just want to introduce yourselves, or just say hi to the audience.
Hey, I'm Hussein. What's up, guys?
Hello, I'm the other guest. You could find my YouTube channel, Ex Non Grata, Existentialist Non Grata. I talk about very based people like Junger and Mishima, so do check it out after you're done listening to this base podcast.
Yeah, a lot of very base people here today.
They're real and cool.
Yeah, very epic. So with regards to identity politics, the first thing I want to like kind of get out of the way is Um, I guess let me ask you guys, would you define identity politics as? Like, what would you give as a rough definition, just so we can like kind of go off of that?
I think identity politics is basically politics based on like unchangeable traits people have, like for example, gender, race, religion, and basically I guess I would classify most identity politics as like a pyramid of oppression. Like the more like not white you are, the more oppressed you are. The more like not male you are, the more oppressed you are. I think I would go off that definition.
Uh, okay. What are your thoughts,
All
X?
right, well, go ahead.
No, I'm asking you to go ahead. Should I call you X during the
Oh,
discussion?
yeah, sure. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, right? I think there's no inherent political partisanship, if you will, um, regarding whiteness or male. I think that's not an inherent part of identity politics. I think that's just how it is according to cultural memetics. I think a more fundamental definition of identity politics could be described as the politics of how you conceptualize yourself, right? How you define yourself and how that definition relates to the public sphere and how it relates to policies enacted by the state, how it's um, how it relates to the uh, economy, culture, society, all that jazz. So I wouldn't even say it's about your immutable traits. No. It's how you see and classify certain traits and how that comes into conflict with other people's definition of you and themselves.
Um, I was under the impression that when we say identity politics, we're talking about like social justice warriors. I know that's an outdated term and it's a pretty cringe term, but I think we're talking about mostly progressives and propagating like this idea, this notion of like traditional like hierarchical structures are being bad and the people who uphold them are bad, and usually those people are like white and male. I thought we are talking about that. I didn't quite understand what you're saying. If you could like dumb it down for me.
Sure. So when I meant identity politics, I literally meant as it is, like the politics of your identity. So I just started off by defining what an identity was, which is how you define and conceptualize yourself, and then you just add the politics of that. Therefore, traits or conceptions or political biases relating to in favor of or against white people or males, or God forbid, white males are not inherent in the question of identity politics. Identity politics will still exist with or without the existence of whites and males or white males.
Oh, okay. I think I understand what you're talking about. But like the way I interpreted the question, I thought we are just talking about like the way it's like the way the movement is now, instead of like just the general definition. But I understand.
I think we can go with both. Like,
You have to
I
have-
think we can talk about like both how identity politics is used in a lot of like more left-wing progressive movements. What and at the same time we can't talk about like identity more broadly. Um, do you guys have any general thoughts on identity politics they want to start off with, or I can throw out some discussion questions with relating to it?
I
You can
feel
tell us
like for me,
specific questions.
yeah, questions.
Sure. So or I guess it's just more discussion topics. So one of the things um very early, like when I was a lot younger, like 14, 15, whenever I heard the word identity politics, I usually thought of, um, yeah, very like social justicey movements where essentially in their rhetoric, they'll use the notion of identity to kind of like bolster their own political ideas. So, for instance, anytime that someone would mention like another person's race as a relevant factor in their arguments, like if you make an argument that someone's like, "Oh yeah, you only say that because you're white" or something, I consider that to be identity politics. Or I, as a white man, am saying this. That's like the usage of your identity within the context of a debate or in the context of an exercise of rhetoric. I thought that that was like the core of identity politics. Um, what are your guys' thoughts on that? The area of identity politics within rhetoric, like the usage of people's identities when they talk about political issues.
Um, I'm not a staunch individualist, but I think overall it could be harmful at times and but most of the time it's just pretty cringe. Like that's honestly the way I view it. Like if we view everything through race and we view everything through gender and we just like narrow down these people into these little boxes that they're bad because they're born into these traits. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. And for rhetoric has been extremely harmful. Like for example in universities there's like clubs based on like religion or race or like sex like gender, I mean. And I think fundamentally those are pretty bad because you're basically like walling off entire groups from each other from interacting with each other and kind of creating an echo chamber. That's kind of the way I view it, but I could be wrong.
Okay. Hmm. There are two interesting points. So the first one was with regards to the language stuff. We'll get how will we get back to more like the clubs stuff, like the example of university clubs you brought up, because that was actually something else I was going to kind of like bring up later on as a
But
potential discussion point. Okay, let me think about how to phrase this.
I can just go through my own personal like experience with the university clubs.
No, I'm thinking that we'll talk about that afterwards because I was wanting to. We can talk about rhetoric at first, and we can go back to that if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So you essentially talked about how oftentimes people will like use other people's identities within rhetoric, like saying, "Oh, you're white," blah blah blah. When you're making arguments, what are your thoughts? So a lot of people I've heard when they talk about things such as where when they'll use like someone's race in an argument. Suppose that I'm a white person. Suppose that I'm talking to a black person, I'm arguing that like systemic racism doesn't exist, and then the black person
Right.
says you're white, you can't comment on it. Um, what are
I
your
would classify that as one negative, very negative aspect of identity politics, at least in the rhetorical sense.
yeah? What are your thoughts on the arguments? Now, I'm not saying I believe this necessarily. Um, I'm just throwing out like different ideas out there just to play around with. What are your thoughts on the argument that
I can
in
know, I know what you're
general,
saying.
when you are,
Yeah.
for instance, like of a certain race that's not necessarily oppressed according to whatever narrative you want to say, um, it may be difficult for you to actually argue about something that you're not necessarily experiencing. Um, so when a minority says, "Oh, you're white, you can't speak on this," while you could argue that that's racist in some to some extent, what are your thoughts on the argument that that is actually describing the fact that you can't actually ascertain um, certain things of reality simply because you don't have those lived experiences.
I think it's very stupid. Because when you say to like a white person, "Oh, you're white, you can't experience racism," what you're doing is ironic. Is very ironic because you, in fact, you're doing racism towards them. So you're making them experience racism by telling them you can't experience racism because you're profiling them based on their race. It's so stupid. Actually grinds my gears. Like, how do I say this? Like. Like there's a lot of people have a lot of different experiences, and grouping people into like groups on race and saying, oh, they have similar experiences may be true, but then turning around and saying that, oh, if someone's in another group, they do not have the same experiences as this group is kind of stupid. I think it's really stupid.
Okay. Um, what are your thoughts on if, for instance, I'm not if someone's using that as a counter argument that like you're white, you can't talk about this, not as a counter argument to the white person claim that they experience racism, but the claim that black people don't disproportionately experience racism. So in this case, it's not simply that you're just giving your own personal experience, but rather you're making assertions about another person's um, own potential experiences or um, group realities.
I think that it doesn't. You can't tell someone what their experiences are, but if how to explain this? Um, like you can't tell someone what their experiences are, but if you make a coherent argument and saying, and you bring up like facts and logic based, to like say, oh, black people don't disproportionately experience racism, and that person says, oh, well, I experience racism. That doesn't mean that they represent the experiences of all black people. Like if it brings up statistics, like a white person says that to a black person, and they bring up statistics like saying, oh, most black people don't feel like they have experienced racism, and that person brings up their own racist experiences, then they're pretty low IQ because they're not able to comprehend that their experiences doesn't represent the experience of the entire group.
Okay. X, do you want to comment on any of this?
Yeah, I think to critique the hypothetical arguments so far and the question so far, I think we have to transcend the false dichotomy. Hussein referred to this problem as cringe. It is not based or cringe. That is a false dichotomy. I think the more appropriate word is it is arbitrary, right? Identity is very arbitrary, and so it leads to it's very meta ironic in this. It's not meta ironic, but it's kind of like forced dimensional ironic in this sense because they're taking something arbitrary like identity, and then they say, well, because you are of this arbitrary identity, um, you cannot experience XYZ. So the statement that you cannot experience XYZ is not arbitrary, but it is based on arbitrary presumptions. And I can prove that like identity is arbitrary because concepts like whiteness is an arbitrary term because for the longest time, people like the Italians were not considered white. However,
Based.
they've kind of more or less um, like they've kind of more or less have begun to be considered white more in more increasingly numbers. But then, um, but then with that being said, they'll still tell people, oh, because you're white, you cannot do this or you cannot believe this or you cannot think that or you can experience this. Even though whiteness itself is it's a fluid and changing identity. The other thing that I want to point out too is the consequences of saying, well, because you are X, or well, I'm X, because you are this or that, you cannot experience this or that. The problem with that is not only does it assume the other person who is not this or that cannot experience something, it also assumes that like the people who are this or that but does not experience it or doesn't agree with that are out of the fold, are out of the identity, if you will, which really complicates things. So for example, to use your example, they'll say, oh, because you're not black, you cannot experience XYZ. However, that then implies that if you are black and you do not agree with that statement, there seems to be a bit of a conflict. And to really dumb this down, I will quote the current president of the United States of America, who once said, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't black." That is a prime example of the trip ups of identity politics. Like of course, and anyone would agree that if you have black skin, you're black. But somehow, because of this identity politics and the associations between your skin color and certain political beliefs, it's like uh, uh, you then have this problem where if you do not follow certain beliefs or certain political ideals, it kind of comes into conflict with something seemingly unrelated like your skin color. But you see, that is the not only the arbitrariness of identity, but that's also the fluidity and the spontaneity of identity. To give another example, right? Like I have black friends who like they like rap music, but I also have black friends who don't like rap music. And like
Dang.
this is their words, not mine. Like they are scared of like being seen as less black by their black friends because of their music tastes. Um, and this isn't just like a black thing, right? So when I go to Japan, for example, people do not see me as Japanese, even though I look like them. I have the same names as them, but because the identity of being Japanese, according to them, is not just racial or ethnic, but also cultural. The way you act, your mannerisms. Because of that, they do not consider me as one of them. They consider me as a foreigner. So, as stupid as as questionable as saying if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. It is a very prevalent and um, well common, not uncommon conception to hold in identity politics.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, when I say, just to bring up your first point, when I say something's cringe, I agree that race is arbitrary. I just call everything cringe because I don't know. Also, I think you made a lot of good points. Like a lot of people, they don't necessarily view black people as like people having specific skin color. They attach a lot of baggage onto like what black people are supposed to be in their minds. A lot of white progressives do this. Like they assume black people to be like, oh, vote Democrat. So when they meet a black Republican or like a black conservative, they get really like pissed off. And I also
Yeah.
wanted to comment, yeah, I also wanted to comment on like the Japan example. I think it's a very like it's a deep rooted like when I went to Ethiopia, I don't think I was considered like Ethiopian or at least Oromo because I didn't speak the language that well and I didn't know like the proper etiquette and the manners and mannerisms like ascribed to my people because I was raised in the West and I was raised in that environment. So I think race is just too shallow of a definition. I think culture goes way deeper than that. So I think there's some really good points you made.
Do you think when you went to, so you are Ethiopian, yes?
Yes.
Do you think when you went to Ethiopia and the reason why you were not considered Ethiopian was because you in fact did not vote for Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think that was an integral point.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, there are a lot of interesting points. One thing. So even though I would agree that yes, race is in a lot of ways very arbitrary and all of that. Do you think that there could be a case to be made that in spite of the fact that a lot of these categories are arbitrary, because in social reality they might actually still manifest themselves. Like we still have the categories of like black, whites, um, all of that. That those might have social implications, even if they're not real in some sense.
I do
Yes.
think so, yes.
Um,
I think so. Oh, go ahead.
in that case, is it possible that identity politics could then have some a good thing? Because if it is the case that there are some social realities behind what are arbitrary terms, those social realities have to be dealt with through acknowledging the fact that there are differences between people within these social realities.
No. Um, wait, you were gonna say something, X? You can go before
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, that's why I said that like calling it based in cringe is a false dichotomy because just because it's arbitrary does not mean it's bad. Right? I did not once say it's bad. I said it's arbitrary, it has like weird problematic implications. It puts things into question, but it is not bad because I think ultimately it is very dependent on the way that it is utilized. So, for example, like the question of like according like anthropologically speaking, from a technical standpoint, there is only one race, and that is the human race. However, people will still but then if somebody treats a people of a certain skin color worse and somebody says, oh, that's racist, like it's not a credible defense to say, well, actually there's only one human race, so I'm not being racist. No, like we accept that like there's a there's a concept of racism without race being a thing. And I think that is the great things about being able to conceptualize abstract concepts where it's like they're not real, but they are real to the extent that we live by it. And I think not that's not just a good thing, right? That's a beautiful thing, because we can create, very complex cultural traditions. We can create complex cultural practices, cultural identities, and yes, they're all arbitrary, but they provide humans with a sense of belongings. They provide humans with a sense of meaning, so on and so forth. So for me, my personal policy is, I think things like cultural identity, which is a part of identity politics, they should be affirmed while being acknowledged that they're not real, right? They're affirmed, but they're not real. And I think if we approach it like that, that would be more optimal to me. So an example of that would be, so if I were American, the wrong way to say is like America's the best country because economy, because military might, because XYZ, because freedom, whatever, because no, no, no. The more correct answer would be America's the best country because I am an American, right? To the absurdity of that statement is what makes it a superior reason, because you're not trying to rationalize why America's the best country, because if you try to do that, you are forgetting that the concept of identity itself is arbitrary. So that's my take on that.
Yeah, I essentially I don't know what I think. Let me think about that for a second.
Yeah, that's actually something that I think it's interesting. We kind of moved away from the discussion of rhetoric, and now or I guess it's kind of within the notion of
It's
rhetoric, but
still
it's
rhetoric because, yeah,
Uh,
because with my
I
example of like why America's the best country. America's not the best country because of XYZ. America's the best country because you're American.
yeah, but you're
right.
not necessarily talking about like conversations which involve identity politics within them. You're more talking about like the broader discourse which informs people's identity politics at a more fundamental level.
Right.
Sure.
I would still say even I agree with some parts of what he said, but I would still say identity politics is a negative, not because like what like the definition is or something like that. It's just how it's used. He also mentioned that the way it's used in a vast majority of the time is in negative, inherently negative through my point of view. The way like silences people, the way like it puts people in like groups and it makes people like think or it's us against them. It's very like it's a group like thinking. I just disagree with that. If you have anything, you can add into that if you want to.
I feel like, okay, when it comes to politics, right, and your a statement on, oh, it's bad because it puts things into groups and an us versus them. I think that question of us versus them precedes identity politics, right? And on this, I subscribe to the idea put forth by the political theorist and lawyer Carl Schmitt, who stated that the very basis of the concept of the political is the friend-enemy distinction, right? You cannot have anything political without a concept of who is my friend and who is not my friend. And
I
so
guess
I
that's kind of
think
true.
it's sort of unfair to put the blame on identity politics as like creating like an us versus them. No, no, no. Identity politics is created because of an us versus them. Us versus them is not created because of identity politics. It's the other way around.
Where do you think an us versus them like kind of conflict comes from? You think it's just inherent to human nature?
I think I think it comes. I think all politics is just a publicization of one's ego and one's sense of self. So I think identity politics comes from how you define yourself. So I do not, right. So I do, and not only that, how you define yourself, which is for me the basis of identity politics, comes from not what you are, but to the degree to which what you are, to degree to which the negation of what you are is present around you. Your identity of who you are becomes present to the degree to which whatever you're not is pressuring upon you, right? So when I think of myself, I do not go about my day thinking about how I'm right-handed, right? Even though that is an extremely intrinsic part of me if you think about it, right? Because I write with my right hand, I eat, right? I hold chopsticks with my right hand, so on and so forth. But I don't think of that, right? However, I can assure you that if there was this discrimination campaign going on where you know only the left-handed people are allowed to live and the rest are like second class citizens, then I think suddenly I would take very I would very patriotic, well I would form like a right hand nationalism. So I think um, that's where that to answer your question, that's where it comes from, and like uh, I think a good example is just a more concrete example, so like patriotism, right? I think, and this is exceptions prove the rule here, but I think more often than not, patriotic countries tend to be countries in which their national sense of self is fragile. So that's why countries like Poland, for example, is way more patriotic than countries like um, Canada, right? Because in the Polish conscience there is that sense that, like, historically speaking, they've been invaded and taken over a bunch of times, so they know the presence of what negates them is real, and they are negated based on their nationality. So I think that's where identity politics comes from.
I have a question. I agree with some parts of that, but do you think ethnicity influences that in any way, or like because the Polish is a very ethnically Poland is a very ethnically homogeneous nation. So, do you think that
Yeah,
um
I think it's not a necessary causation. So I'm not a historian, but I have been told. Yeah, yeah, no, I take it back. Like I don't know. Like, for example, I think ethnicity is not necessary to create like a cohesive identity, but it is very strongly related. So much so that it makes forming an identity much easier if you make a homogeneous identity. But again, the homogeneous identity is right. An ethnically homogeneous identity are not strongly identifiable with each other because a bunch of people are of the same ethnicity. No, it's because outside of their borders, a bunch of people without their ethnicity exists, right? If everyone was the same skin color, and there was not a lack of there was not this sense in the conscience of the culture of different skin color beyond the borders. I think there will be you know a divide in class, divide in um, physical or mental abilities, a divide in political attributes, all right, political beliefs, and that's why I think you don't see this um, unity amongst people based on the fact that they are people, right? Because this whole notion of a non-people, a non-person, a non-Homo sapien attacking us based on the fact that we are non-Homo sapien, it's not that prevalent in urban cosmopolitan life. It's only prevalent when you're out in the wilderness and nature. Um, so yeah. So basically, if aliens attack us, I think that would solve racism.
based. I think that you make a lot of good points there, but I am a history major, and I just want to comment on this. I think the concept of race, like you said, is it didn't originate in like the Middle Ages, where Europe was very ethnically homogenous, and there was like while there was like different tribes and stuff, there was like they're essentially they were all Indo-European, they're all white, and the what at least from my knowledge, race originated from the start beginnings of slavery, at least in the Spanish Empire, and the need to distinguish between like the different social and racial classes between the white Spanish, the mixed people, and then the black slaves. Another point you made, I guess, was what is it again? Okay, I kind of forgot. Whatever. But I think I agree with you for the most part.
From what I could I clarify some of the regards to those historical details? Is that when you talk about how the notion of race originated with slavery through the Spanish Empire? Is that related to our current understanding of race, or were there other ways in which we classified groups of people ethnically in the past?
Um, in the past, I guess no, but I at least from what I know, the race originated from the Spanish Empire, and then it got cemented with nationalism in the 18th to the 17th centuries with the development of the nation state. And since all and the idea of an ethnicity having its own nation state, like for example, the Italian unification, the idea that Italians are their own ethnicity and therefore they deserve a nation state. Before that, my knowledge is way too spotty. Like before the Spanish Empire terminology which is body to make a definitive statement on it, but I don't think so. I guess there's like some. It was mostly like social classes. Like for example, in Rome, there was definitely some differences between like the wealth and the socioeconomic outcomes of different like people who are not Latin or not Greek. But I don't think it was as rigid as the social structure brought about by the Spanish Empire, basically because of the agricultural and hierarchy they established in the New World and in Europe.
Sure. I'm
May,
just
may, may I comment on that?
Yes.
sure, go ahead.
I think this whole notion of like racial differences and like racial identity being formed as a result of like Europeans and slavery is it's very it's very questionable to say the least, and I think it's just fake news propagated by the school system, who are very adamant on pushing a Euro-critical um, curriculum because I can give you a lot of examples of how there were notions of like racial differences uh, before slavery in Europe, right? And I think this is the irony of like this is where like identity politics shoots itself in the foot because the whole point Eurocentrism is being questioned in the universities is because of like the identity politics that places Europeans as a cohesive identity, which is then which then the those against it are trying to push down. But by wanting to push that down, they are inadvertently creating a Eurocentric culture by only considering the ways that the Europeans considered race. There were other right like let's not forget that like there were other uh, groups of people outside of Europe, and like for example, apparently, and my sources are dubious on this, um, but like my sources basically trust me, bro. But apparently, when the Chinese first met the Japanese, we were kind of referred to as the dwarf people. You know,
Oh yeah,
like
that's
those
true.
small,
That's true.
yeah, like those small midgets, and which, and I think that's because the Chinese had this conception that like the Japanese was a different ethnicity. So and that dwarf system was way like I think it was in the single digit century era. So
Um, I know.
yeah.
I think I fundamentally disagree. The reason why we look at European notions of race isn't because of European ethnocentrism. It's because Europe owns the world. It's because European culture, European
Okay,
ideas.
no. But here's the thing: to say that Europe owns the world, what does that assume? Right? It assumes it presupposes that the people who own the it presupposes how do you say um it okay, I don't know how to explain this.
I'm talking about like culturally, Europe has the most influence. So we bring
Sure.
a lot of like ideas that brought to the third world are downstream from European schools of thought.
Okay, but you understand how because of that, because we're making this equation here, it kind of inadvertently creates the illusion that like notions of salt today are said to be originated from there, such as your aforementioned racism, which would not be possible if identity politics did not exist, because identity politics is what enabled us to define the Europeans as one group. When in other cultures, there is no such thing, there is no continent called Europe. It is called Eurasia, right? So, be, by defining the Europeans as this arbitrary group of people with like fairly white skin and and these attributes, you then say, okay, well, these people are ruling the world, and therefore there is Eurocentrism. However, the very essence of Eurocentrism is is arbitrary, and that's what I meant when earlier at the beginning of the podcast when I said that there is a there is a real consequences based on arbitrary notions, right? So race is an arbitrary notion, but there are real consequences of racism. To be European is arbitrary in that sense, but Eurocentrism is more real, and I think that's one of the questions that we have to address when it comes to identity politics because you get these problems.
Do you
Uh,
do you think though that because of the fact that yes, these things such as race exist in social realities, that there therefore might actually be some merit in describing, like Hussein said, that the majority of our cultural ideas around the world come from Europe, like surrounding
I
race
think
at least?
I think there's merit insofar as we address that. Like there's also like no merit is a merit in and of itself if it does not address the shortcomings of that merit, right? Oh, I want $1 million. I made $1 million through my business today. Well, if we're not going to address the fact that we have to pay our taxes from there, well, that merit kind of defeats itself, right? Because we lose that money because of tax fraud, and tax evasion. So if we have this notion of um, these groups of people, which we call the Europeans, have this dominance over our culture. Yeah, that creates a that reflects, that's a useful reflection of our current reality. However, we have to address we have to address the shortcomings of that because because of this, when we think of when we think of struggles against European colonization, what do we think of? We do not we think of indigenous groups trying to struggle for independence. We do not think of non-European countries becoming imperial powers to create like a power struggle to offset the European dominance over an area, because that's what the Japanese did. But because this whole notion of Eurocentrism mixed in with mixed in with our concept of history, we have a very limited view of of historical processes, and that is because of the
um,
shortcomings of identity politics.
right. I just want to clarify on the slavery example I used. I think what I was trying to get at is that our institutions and slavery, I'm not saying slavery didn't exist before Europeans uh institutionalized it or made it like tenfold, but what I'm trying to say is that a lot of institutions that are in third world countries right now devolved from Europe. So I think you're mostly correct. I'm again my history is good, but my philosophy isn't that good. So I
Yeah,
could understand
like
some of what you're saying.
my point is basically we make connotations and associations in our head that may not reflect realities, and that is due to identity political classifications that did in fact make that did reflect reality. So, for example, if I imagine you to picture a slave, you're most likely gonna think of a non-white person enslaved by a white person. As you said, slavery existed before the European slavery happened, but because this whole concept of European Eurocentrism is so ingrained, we do not we it does not occur to us that other non-white people enslaved other non-white people plus white people.
Yeah, that actually brings an interesting point up. In at least I'm a history student, but at least in like from the I think 14th century to like the 20th century, it's some people refer to the age of Europe because of like a vast influence Europe held and like the way they basically reshaped the world for themselves. I also want to talk about you like your example of we think about like we think about like indigenous peoples resisting European colonization. We don't think about like you like indigenous peoples creating their own imperial empires. I think that's a really good point, and it brings up the infantilization of like minorities and against like non-European peoples by Europe, like like the diaspora and European people in like the West. Like they think of like they perpetually think of like non-white people as like oppressors, not oppressors, the oppressed, and they're like unable to do anything. They almost like think of them as like they treat them as children almost. But I yeah, that's what I want to add.
But they treat them as children of because the over pervading conceptions of arbitrary identity that does reflect real world.
Right.
Do you think that there might be some merit in still having? I know that you're suggesting at the very discussion of the notion that say Europeans culturally influence the world disproportionate or something like that, that in of itself reinforces um, the European centric views. Do you think that there might be some merit though to the idea that through discussing the fact that Eurocentrism exists, that we can actually change it, and that therefore when we're talking about certain things which we believe are true about Europe historically and how European societies have influenced the world historically, that we can actually change our view away from a Eurocentric view simply by acknowledging that.
Yeah, I
People don't
think we
even
can.
oh,
Uh,
continue.
all right, I think we can. It's just it that doesn't. It's not a necessary. It doesn't necessarily lead to that. Lead to that, right? So, for example, I always have this idea that like to become free, you have to rebel against whatever it is that's not keeping you free. But rebels are never actually free, because by rebelling, you are still acknowledging the domination of whatever it is that you are rebelling against. And just because, and so to transcend that stage, you do have to rebel, but just because you rebel does not mean you will transcend that stage.
Then, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're then, in a sense, supporting the acknowledgments of and supporting, like, describing the world as Eurocentric, as a way to attempt to disprove these notions of Eurocentrism. Then, that if we discuss the fact that the world has been viewed through a Eurocentric lens in the past, that we can change that, even though it doesn't necessarily lead to that, that is still a necessary condition to discuss the existence of Eurocentrism in order to be able to uh, reduce it.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, every merit has its shortcomings, but there's nonetheless still that merit.
Okay. Um, do you guys want to? I remember Hussein at the very beginning. You also discussed use the example of like clubs on campus in which there are groups which deliberately attempt to like assert their own identity in some way. Do you want to speak more to your thoughts on that? Maybe we can switch the topic over to that because I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. If we're gonna talk about like rhetoric, I think I think university clubs like doing it based on race or religion is very, very foolish. I think it's how do I say this? I think it's actually very harmful because like X said, like there's always gonna be like an us versus them mentality because of like the numerous like philosophical notions you brought up. But I just think in a way it teaches people to it just doesn't. I think integration is very important, at least in Western society, and it helps people to like resist integrating more better into Canadian society. Like for example, I was at the Palestinian protest that happened today, and there's a lot of like there. I think there's a few counter protesters, but protesting the open use of this like the Quran, quoting the Quran in public prayer, and it's supposedly secular institution. So I think like doing it based on religion and a secular institution is pretty harmful to like the values of at least Canadian values. And you guys can speak on that if you want to.
I think to view the existence of these groups based on their race or religion or whatever, to view it as cringe or based is ultimately going to depend on your political views and your political biases. Um, and so, like, you say they have to integrate to the fold. However, I would argue that you only say that because the world would then be beneficial because your political views, which again to me is the publicization of your ego, is is uh your political views is better suited when people integrate in a more secular context. So I think not only is it inevitable, but um, it's something that to view it as cringe is all it's cringe in and of itself because I think the more appropriate step would be to see it as sort of like a power struggle of different memetics, right? Different memetic forces of these identities, and to say, okay, well, it's inevitable that they're gonna push for their identity. So the only solution is to push for our identity by ironically enough, by saying it's cringe. See, but this is what I mean, where it's like if you say it's cringe for the wrong reasons, I think that's extra cringe. But if you say it's cringe for the right reasons, I think that's super based. Because when you say it's cringe for the wrong reasons, such as they're not integrating, I think that's super cringe. But if you say it's cringe because well they're not integrating and it would help my political biases and political needs if they did integrate, so I am going to pressure and I'm going to pressure and advocate for the integration of people in my vicinity to integrate. I think that is a very based.
That's very interesting. Well, I guess I have a question for you. Why do you think these people, like these essentially defeated peoples, because they were defeated by Europe in one way or another, why do you think when they come to the West, they double down on their cultural values? And because I think I noticed this phenomenon, especially when I travel. I think people, Muslims, at least I'll use an Islamic example. I think Muslims in the West are way more conservative they are back home because back home they're trying to emulate more Western values because Western values they're downstream of the West, while inside the West they're trying to emulate more Islamic values because they want to hold on to something. Or what do you think the reason for this is? I'd be curious to hear your take.
I think there's not a good enough equation to be drawn between a state has been defeated or the cultural zeitgeist has won out. Like there's no black or white um, a victory here, right? It's in the form of degrees. The only way you can actually like win over people is to negate their very existence. And it's like I say it's in degrees, right? So another example that you can draw is like the identity of Latin Americans or the identity of white Americans, right? Latin Americans, they predominantly speak Spanish or Portuguese, some French if you're in like French Guyana, or or English if you're in the country next to it, but predominantly Spanish and Portuguese. However, they do not identify themselves as Spanish or Portuguese. In fact, um, the descendants of Spain and Portuguese rebelled against them to create their own countries. However, they still speak the language. The point that I'm trying to make is like um, there is no black or white 100% all or nothing on the adoption of identity and the pressure and holding fast to their values. They're still going to retain some values whether they won or not, whether they won or lost. And to draw back to my first point, just because you win does not mean that like all opposition is completely obliterated, right? Um, this
Ah,
is why yeah, so this is why, despite the Americanization of the world, there is still, certain cultures around the world still retain, a huge part of their way of life.
I think we're fundamentally misunderstanding each other because you're looking at this through like a heavy philosophical lens, while I'm looking at it as a more historical lens. I guess I'll try to uh
Please
redefine what
dumb
I'm
it down.
saying. Yeah. Um. I guess when I say when, I'm talking about like the way Europe has like defeated these cultures, like the way everyone talks, like the global language is English. These people watch American television. These people watch American cartoons. These people eat American foods. These people like they have lot essentially they lost the culture. and the economic hegemon is the United States, the military hegemon is the United States, the political hegemon is the United States. I think when we talk about if we look at it through that lens, these people were essentially defeated. But I guess your comment on they would have to support their very existence to be defeated. I don't really understand that. If you could like clarify it for me.
Not subvert, they would have to destroy their very existence to completely wipe out any semblance they have with their previous culture.
Because it'll always be inside of them in their heads, right?
Exactly. And also, I think you're falling into the very trap of identity politics, where you're assuming because you're XYZ, you're gonna act XYZ. Right? No two people from the same country is the same. You assume, right? That presumption is there precisely because of of the fallacies of identity politics, right? So you say, oh, well, how come this culture has been defeated by this culture? So why do the defeated cultures still act this way? Well, no two people are the same way, and you do see differences in degrees. For example, I forgot the exact term for it, but like I've had friends from like countries who were colonized by like multiple countries over the span of their country's existence, and they tell me that like their friends and families have this tendency to defer to like um, American international order. They defer for their self determination. So if there's a debate regarding foreign policy, oh, what should we do? They say, oh, let's just leave it to the Americans, right? You see that less and less in other countries. For example, and I'm generalizing here, countries of like France, for example, the world does not speak French predominantly. However, the French still retain this adamancy to retain French influence, and they'll try not to defer um, to the American hegemonic order, and that's why like there were conflicts within NATO, for example. I think during the Iraq War, when
It
France
was
was like, no, man,
war. Yeah. They
yeah, I was like,
opted out of the
no,
Iraq war.
yeah, exactly. They didn't want to go in, so
I, I guess looking at it from a geopolitical lens, I disagree. I think when France, going to that example, I think when France refuses to acknowledge the American hegemon, I don't think it creates a French hegemon, or I don't think it disqualifies the American hegemon. I just think it makes them arrogant. Um, because like if we're going to ignore the fact that the United States is the most powerful culturally, politically, socially, I just don't think that's very like intelligent, or it doesn't disprove what's actually going on in the ground. And I think I can agree with you on the fact that not one person acts the same, but I think I'm talking about generally like the power that America holds, like in the way we interpret the world.
I don't understand. So I feel like you're using the word arrogant in a way in a disproving manner. Like, oh, it's but I really do not understand the problem with them being arrogant in that sense, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to uphold, right? They're trying to uphold, they are trying to uphold their hegemony. That's what they're doing. But that's what all states are trying to do, right? All living, right? I do think of a state as a living form, in a metaphorical sense. In all living forms, they try to do two things. That is reproduce, which is to replicate, and to expand. And I think so. I don't like that's
I
like saying that's arrogant. That's like saying it's arrogant for a small business to try to expand their profits when Jeff Bezos is and Elon Musk has like much larger businesses, and they own a lot of the markets, and they control a lot of the markets. Like it's just kind of redundant to say
Could
they're arrogant.
could I intervene for a sec?
uh
I'm not sure what this. Maybe I've missed something or had a stroke. I think we got off of the topic of talking about like informal organizations of groups of people. Like we were initially talking about like the clubs at UFC which have which base their entire organization off of identity, and then we got on to like the Muslim club and how they did a Palestine protest earlier today. And then we got off into a bunch of random international politics stuff. Um,
Not gonna lie, it was a base conversation, but you kind of saved me because I had no response to what he was saying.
okay.
Get wrecked,
Um,
bro. Boom, boom, boom. Knockout.
okay. Uh, hmm. Okay, so Hussein, are you against all clubs being on the basis of identity, whether it be like religious or ethnic or gender identity?
I think it would be too much of a hassle because these people are they're heavily invested in their group identities, which is not a bad thing inherently. But I think if you try to take away, like you can't do it all at once because they're all gonna band together and be like, oh, they're violating our freedom of religion. But you can't do it one at a time because they're gonna be like, oh, you're targeting us because of our religion and you're not targeting other people. It's just in the pot. Like theoretically, I would approve it. Practically, it's impossible.
You know what? Actually, can I interject here?
Actually, wait, could I ask one more question first?
Sure.
Just because I'm
Go ahead.
curious. Um, okay, I'm trying to like push too hard against arguments. I'm trying to like be relatively neutral, so I'll try to phrase this in a neutral way. Um, I know that for often I find that when friends meet each other, one of the very common, one of the important things that like helps to establish a bond between friends is some commonality. So, for instance, I'm Irish Italian. If I randomly found out that someone that I was talking to was like Irish, I'd be like, oh, that's so cool, interesting. I'm Irish too. As opposed to if they were, say, I don't know, Swedish, I wouldn't have that same reaction necessarily. And I might, on some intuitive level, even if that doesn't give them like any shared experience with me, that doesn't give them any commonalities with me in any sense, really. Just the fact that there's like that label there of us both originating from that, having to originate from that one place, like that might give me, or at least other people, like a sense of commonality through which to build a relationship potentially, or at least like a conversation starter that helps to break the ice. Do you think that at some point there might actually be um, something natural to the fact that people like commonalities, whether it be something as culturally significant as religion, or even just belonging to a similar ethnicity when it comes to a lot of the ethnic-based clubs on campus.
Um, yeah, I know. I think I'm sorry. I kind of zoned out, but I got the gist of what you're trying to say. Um, yeah. 1 second. Hold up. Something came.
All right. I can interject here. Well, I think there is some. Okay, I think there is something to be said there, and it's the reason why you feel connection is because is because of the identity politics that you hold, right? Never once did I say that it was bad to have identity politics in your conception. I said it was inevitable, it was natural, and I just wish that people acknowledge that it was arbitrary, but still affirm it anyways. So I think that explains why you feel connection when you meet a when you meet a fellow Irishman.
I don't think it's necessarily even politics per se. Like I I suppose I probably shouldn't have used the racial example, or it's more ethnic. Just to
Okay.
get more like the broader point. But even if, for instance, I know that when I don't care about whether I'm left-handed or right-handed. I happen to be left-handed, so I'm relatively rare. I'm uncommon in the population, but often like I'll just be writing something, and a friend who I've known will be like, "Wow, that's so cool! I'm left-handed too." And I don't really care, but they seem to care a lot simply because of this just arbitrary commonality that exists. Um, like
It's
I don't think
I
because
it's
it's an
think
even
arbitrary commonality that they prioritize.
okay.
I guess we
Hmm.
all like the world like through different lenses, but I wanted to say, these people I want to touch on these people naturally like go into groups with different commonalities, and like the bigger like the more significant the commonality is, like for example religion or ethnicity, the bigger the groups these things will be. I don't know why the reason for that is. I guess it's just because like X talked about is the us versus them like kind of mentality, and like I truly don't know, but I guess X is kind of right on that.
Do you think it's possible
Yeah,
to
I suppose.
So I know that. Do you think it's possible to get rid of that? Like that desire to, for
No, I don't.
instance, be?
No. I don't think so.
Not only is it possible, it's also not preferable.
Why?
I okay, so this goes into, remember how I said earlier, can I interject? And then
Yeah.
Jonathan wanted to talk about Irish people. I mean, nothing against that. I like Irish people, but
Hey, you better
uh,
you better you better like Irish people, okay? You know.
Wait, are you Irish and Italian like Nick Fuentes?
Wait, is he Irish Italian? I thought he was like part
Yeah, he
Hispanic.
is. No, he was
yeah,
Irish
he's just,
Italian. He's not even
his name is
Hispanic.
Fuentes.
His name's
His name is
Fuentes.
He
Like,
Fuentes.
Nick Fuentes is Italian? Is that
okay.
Spanish?
No, he's Hispanic, I think,
Anyways,
like at least part. Okay, let's not talk about
tan, tan,
figures like that on
tangents
here.
aside,
Okay, my bad.
tangents
It's all good.
tangents aside, when Hussein was talking about how these like ethnic clubs in school do not integrate, it really, I can't help but be reminded of like those immigrants that go around saying, "Oh, we have too many immigrants," and like, but then if you
Me,
confront
literally
them
me.
about it, if you confront them about it, they'll be like, "Oh no, no, I'm one of the good immigrants because I actually integrate." The problem is though, they're not acknowledging the bias that they have, in that the degree to which one should integrate is conveniently the degree to which they actually do integrate. If you get what I mean. So for example, like if a, like, let's say, um, okay, so Hussein, like, you're not white, and you say, "Oh, we have too many immigrants," like a white
I
immigrant
never
could
said
just look
that.
at.
I never said that.
That's
I
saying,
never
no, no,
said we had too
hypothetically.
many immigrants. Okay,
No,
go ahead.
I'm saying hypothetically. Okay, if you did or didn't, I don't care. Like a white immigrant could say, "Whoa, no, whoa, like you can't really say that because my standard is that not only do you have, like, immigrants are okay, they just have to be of a certain skin color, right?" That they could say that, but they're not acknowledging either that they're biased because they view themselves as like the the benchmark of what, the borderline between what is okay or
The
not.
model
And then
immigrant is what you're trying to get at, right?
yeah, but then somebody who is not an immigrant and who is white can just go at both of them and say, "Man, shut up, man! Like, both of you are being stupid because this country should be filled with people like me, right?" So, but all three of you are saying we have to. This country should be an integrated country.
But they all mean different things, right? But
They
also,
all
what
mean
does it
different
mean?
things.
But what does it mean to be an immigrant? I'm a second generation immigrant. I'm not a first generation. Also, what does it mean to integrate? Like, by what standards? Everyone has different standards,
That's what
right?
I'm saying. People have different standards.
Exactly, dog.
No, I'm critiquing you.
I don't know what's going on.
You're like, "Oh, these groups across campus, they're not integrating." Somebody could just say that about you.
Okay, that's true, but I have no kind of
"Oh
argument
no,
to that.
don't worry. I actually integrate. Not like them." And like
I'm
it's
I'm one of the
arbitrary,
good
dude.
ones. Exactly,
Yeah,
yeah.
because,
I guess you're
oh,
right.
oh, oh, I'm one of the good ones. Like, so
Okay, I'm not, I don't sound like that.
Okay.
that's why the stupidest thing to do is say, "Oh yeah, it is arbitrary, so we should just drop it all together." No, no, no. The correct thing to do is, yes, I do acknowledge that it is arbitrary, but I'm going to view myself as the center of the universe and acknowledge and affirm that I am the best. I am the best type there is, and I'm gonna work hard to, you know, create a bend in like the curvature of our culture so that people act more like me, because that's what politics is essentially, like I said. So I think you have to acknowledge that it's arbitrary and then work to like affirm the power and the influence of your arbitrary values.
I guess
In
I said
essence,
that.
you can cause hierarchical postmodernism.
Yeah, I'm too bad at philosophy to understand what you
Okay.
just said, but I'm gonna just say
I think
based.
I I think I kind of understand what you're saying. Do you think that that might, though, at the end just lead to like serious power games played between people where if
Wait, I
everyone
have a
essentially
question.
adopts
I have
that
a wait, hold
philosophy,
on.
like then everyone's just
You mean power? You mean power games that already exist and have already existed and have been existing ever since the idea of self and others have been around?
well, I think that and maybe we disagree on this. I think that when it comes to politics, like there is obviously some level of self-interest when someone advocates their own political beliefs. But at the same time, there is some broader sense of what is in the collective interest beyond myself. When we discuss
Why do
politics.
people care about but why do people care about the collective interests?
I the it doesn't matter why, it's just something that is, and therefore I think that if it
I
is
think I think it does matter why, and I think people, whether they acknowledge it or not, care about the collective interests because they care about themselves and they value the collective interest. Therefore, to care about the collective interest and to affirm that is to look after your own personal needs. This is why people who are less advantageous in life have less advantageous qualities in life that gets them ahead in life. Like, I don't know, maybe you're less attractive than the average Joe. They tend to believe in more. They tend to advocate for policies that do, help out and further collective interests. People who are more have more advantageous traits, they tend to be a bit against that. So I think that is also um, you gotta also acknowledge the arbitrariness here. You gotta acknowledge and affirm and go along with the arbitrariness.
I have a question. So
but
should these groups say they I'm sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
in that case then aren't you just saying then I guess it's not as extreme than that I originally thought were so to get back to the integration example, while your standard for integration is obviously going to include yourself, you're also taking into account the more broader societal factors involved as opposed to strictly saying, oh, yes, this is, I believe in integration on this standard solely because it's the one that helps me out. It's more of a broad, holistic view of it that it not simply helps me out, but it also helps everyone out more broadly.
No, but you only care about helping everyone out broadly because that helps you,
Yeah,
right?
but it's
This
a
is
lot.
why I said
Yeah, it's a lot. It's an indirect form of egoism.
yes. This is why, like for example, the immigrant who believes that integration should also stand on like racial lines. That's kind of less helpful to the collective. The more ethnically heterogeneous a society is, but because it that's advantageous to him to disregard that, he's gonna go along with it.
So then how do you communicate then in that context? So if you're looking at your self-interest and you're suggesting that you should explicitly affirm your self-interest, how do you communicate with other people then? Do you just appeal to more of the broader societal interest while also subtly like having your personal interest in mind?
It depends. It
Oh,
depends on where
tough
you draw the
question.
line. Again, like for example, if you draw the line of like, oh, well, my self interest is furthering humanity based on the concept that we are humans, right? Then obviously that's a lot easier line to draw because you just have but the more strict you are, the more you have to discriminate. For example, the concept of a state, right? And I mean state, not a country, not a nation, a state. The concept of a state is inherently discriminatory against people who are not citizens because the concept of a state fundamentally um, views the distinction between citizen and non-citizen. And then you have these people of different ideas of nationalism say, well, not only do you have to have the certain citizenship, but only certain people can have such citizenship. With a lot of with some people, it's based on culture, right? It's some people based on like ideology. So if right, so certain ideologies in certain countries are illegal. Um, and other places, it's based on like race or ethnicity. And for others, it's birthright. If you're born in a country, you could be a citizen. And for others, it's well, if you have a father who is of that country, then you can have that country. But if you yourself are born here without your father being born here, or he's not a citizen, then no luck to you. So, um, So, if to answer a question, just looking at the behavior of the state is a very good example because they take the arbitrariness and they hold fast to it.
Okay, so, but when it comes to the state justifying its own existence, even though it's looking at it from a level of arbitrariness and categorize who is it and isn't in the state, they still would you suggest that the way in which the state justifies itself is not through arguing about its own self-interest, but rather appealing to more broad things that would therefore allow other people to feel justified in supporting the state?
I mean, you only have to do that to the degree that it's necessary, right?
Sure.
When do countries try to rally the people on a patriotic basis? It's when the country itself is under attack, right? Like you don't see members of a feminist rally say, "Well, we are Americans," and America. Okay, actually, they kind of do that. Like, oh, to be Americans means to be a feminist. Okay, like they kind of do that, but it's not inherent, right? You would much more likely to see, feminists at a feminist rally on the basis of, being a female. And whereas, if the country is under attack, oh, well, feminism, capitalism. No, no, no. It's being of that country. So they appeal to the base to the degree to which they have to, right? A good example of this is populist politicians. Populist politicians are notorious for being very unhinged in the beginning because they have to create this populist image, and also because they're usually outsiders. The only people that support them are, the fringe. And then, if by miracle they do win their party, and now they have to go on to the general elections. What did they do? They tone down their rhetoric, right? They tone it down so that they can appeal to a broader base. So that should answer the question.
Um, okay, it does that makes sense. I'm kind of breaking how I usually I know with a lot of these podcasts I kind of interject my own opinions. I try to kind of avoid it, but at this point I don't care that much. Like I think in general, like at the beginning of podcasts I just try and like just kind of get other people's views, and then I can start like interjecting with my own thoughts on things later on. Um, you kind of discussed why it's descriptively the case that people do base their own justifications for who they classify as in groups and out groups and what they classify as yeah, on like their own personal interest, like with the integration example, like with the state example, like with the populist example, I guess. Um, do you think that you imply that as an inherently good thing? Is it because you consider egoism to be in and of itself a good value, or
Like the affirmation of this arbitrary thing. Do I
yeah, that the
like
because the
the
affirmation of this arbitrary thing
oh oh
essentially promotes the self-interest, that that's you not only suggest that that's something
yeah,
that
yeah,
descriptively happens that's prescriptively
because
good.
yeah, it's good because the to anchor yourself to a collective identity makes you stronger, right? And um, it makes you stronger because you have more people on your side. So uh, so it's a very it's a very simple egoist reason.
In that sense, I guess yeah, I assume you are in support of or at least tolerance of the idea of movements existing on the basis of race, or I guess even we could go as simple as just like clubs on university campuses that exist on the basis of religion, race, culture, all that.
Yeah, only if they only if they affirm my politics and my way of life. I
Okay.
support
Everyone has
democracy
to
if the
agree with
people
me.
vote in favor of policies that I support of.
I should be world dictator, and I should dictate everything to everyone. Based. Let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, like the reason why I don't protest when these groups pop up is, one, they don't really like hinder me. Like they kind of like stick to their own and they don't get in my way. So I don't really care. Um, and so, but so I'm in support of these groups it's kind of like, okay, they're not my enemies, right? I have nothing against them, but it is, but it's fundamentally the same logic where it's like, well, you're not necessarily part of them, but it's like, oh, okay, well, if I was in their shoes, I would do the same thing, and I do the same things on a regular basis, right? We it, like we I like for example, we are talking on Discord, right? We discriminate which Discord servers to join based on our interest. Now that may not be on like race or religion, but it is based on like academic interests that interest us. So like we're all doing the same thing here. So I'm neutral on the idea itself, and I'm in favor of those who apply that neutral idea in my favor.
Okay. I kind of dislike the way in which you're phrasing the self-interest stuff, but at the same
Based,
time, I think that if I were to, sorry, I think I'm getting feedback on Hussein's end.
yeah, you are.
Yeah, I think that, oh, I think it's good now. Yeah, for a second, my audio was coming back on your end, and like coming back through the
Oh,
mic. It's all
my
good.
bad.
I think it's fine now, but I, I think I kind of dislike the way X in which you're phrasing a lot of it, like suggesting that it's based on your self-interest, specifically. But I think if I were to push you on it, like I did before, like essentially as you clarify and as you discuss more, I think I would agree with like the underlying ideas behind it.
Nice.
Yeah, because it's kind of like a weird like altruistic egoism like mix. It's kind of convoluted, but yeah, I understand where you're coming from. We've been going at this for just under an hour and 20. Is there anything else you guys want to discuss? Or we can just call it a day.
I think the only identity that should be tolerated is Discord nationalism.
True. Okay.
Hey,
Discord
true,
nationalism
true.
based. And to the viewers at
But
home, okay,
that's
this
all I
is why
have.
you should join the Youth for Discourse Discord because Discord nationalism is the
Oh,
ultimate way of
yeah.
this is the ultimate identity, the only based identity to have.
It's the only
Yes,
one
use for
founded in logic and facts.
Yeah, facts and logic. So true. You know. I
yep.
I think that I think I'm good to call it here. Do you guys I guess you guys don't have much else to say.
I think I got to everything I wanted to say. The philosophy talk, I couldn't understand it, but I guess I did it to my best of my ability. Let's
Yeah,
go, guys.
look, the whole point of these podcasts is it's not like us going at us, screaming at each other. It's supposed to be a learning community, which we're trying to understand different perspectives more, trying to learn more about different issues. So it's not like the intent is not to bring people in who are necessarily like super hard lined in a stance. It's more just to have a conversation where we just learn about stuff, um, and unpack issues. That's why when I interview, when I first start these podcasts, at least recently, I've been like more interviewing, just questioning people a lot more, just like getting to understand their perspective, have them like voice their opinions and arguments on various things, as opposed to me just like hardline telling my stance.
Right. I think
What you're
that's good.
saying is, what you're saying is constructive dialogue nationalism.
Exactly, yeah. Constructive dialogue nationalism. Yeah, I think I'm gonna end it here because honestly, that was a very interesting discussion. That actually went really well. Like, I was very interested in a lot of the things that are being discussed. We went over so many areas. We talked about like identity politics and rhetoric. We talked about identity politics when it comes to like clubs and stuff like that. We talked about like national identities. We talked about a ton. It was fairly abstract, but it was good. It was good. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah, I think I'm gonna end it here. To the viewers at home, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.